Hello, everyone. It's CATE STILLMAN with the Yogahealer Podcast, and I'm here with Mark Mattson, who is the former chief of the Lab of Neurosciences at National Institute on Aging and is now faculty at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. And I'll talk a little bit more about your research, but one of the things that I found right away in researching for my book, Wild Habits, was your article on an evolutionary perspective on why food overconsumption impairs cognition. I just want you to start right there with the title and unpack what that means.
Yes, I think it's instructive to begin with this evolutionary perspective on eating patterns. You know, how often, how much do animals in the wild eat? And most mammals in the wild, all of them essentially, they live in environments where food is relatively scarce and they have to work for it. And so during evolution, individuals whose brains and bodies functioned well in a food deprived state had a survival advantage. And this includes our human ancestors prior to the agricultural revolution. So hunter-gatherers.
Like the Green Revolution, just talking like the last 75 years.
No, I'm talking like the last.
Or 10,000 years.
10,000 years,
okay.
Yeah. Since agriculture, and then you grow food and you can store it and have it available all the time.
Yeah.
And so anthropologists have shown, very interestingly, there's several studies that they estimated brain size based on skull cranial volume.
Yeah.
And human brains have gotten smaller overall from like 20,000 years ago till today. And so anyway, after the agricultural revolution, our brains have gotten smaller. And so we've become more specialized, right? And probably there's some reorganization of brains so that we can function very well focusing on like one specific task or something. However, we do most of our thinking like we're doing now, sitting in a chair, whereas animals in the wild, they're thinking while they're moving through their environment.
Yeah.
And so it turns out that we find that both exercise, physical exercise, and intermittent fasting have similar effects on the brain and body. There's differences in terms of how much, for example, obviously exercise has a more beneficial effect on your muscles and cardiovascular system. And then from the standpoint of the brain, which I study, both intermittent fasting and exercise improve learning and memory and protect the brain against dysfunction during aging. But getting back to the evolutionary perspective, so our brains have gotten smaller since we don't have to spend our time figuring out how to get food. It's also true with domesticated animals. So dogs, for example, if you look at the brain size of a domesticated dog, that it's a similar body size as a wolf, the domesticated animal's brain is smaller. And again, similar thing, they have food available all the time and they aren't spending their waking hours moving around trying to figure out how to get food. So, and then from the standpoint, so this paper I wrote on food overconsumption, humans, people nowadays with obesity, adults, and it's also been looked at in children with obesity, their brain size is on average smaller than their peers with normal body weight. And in humans, living humans, we can also look at the size of different regions of the brain by using magnetic resonance imaging, MRI. And there's one region in the brain in particular, the hippocampus, that's smaller in people with obesity. And it's also, we've shown this in laboratory rats and mice too, that if you give them high fat sugar diet, they become obese and the hippocampus gets smaller. Hippocampus plays an important role in what we call spatial memory. So when you navigate, move through your environment, remembering, where you've gone, and so that you can, it's a big survival advantage if you remember where you've gone and, oh yeah, there was that tree, there's fruit on that tree or whatever, or yeah, there was a herd of so-and-so animals, and then you go back to your tribe mates. But anyway, this is also interesting. There was a study of cab drivers. This is quite a while ago now in London. This is before GPS. So cab drivers in London, their hippocampus is bigger than non-cab drivers. Now, there hasn't been a study, I don't think, now that the cab drivers use GPS, but my guess is, since they're not having to remember these spatial things. Okay, but anyway, it's not good to overeat for your brain in addition to your body.
What are you seeing in terms of, well, I mean, two things right away I'm curious about is like what you see in terms of the behaviors of people that have a smaller, undeveloped hippocampus. And the other is, I know with, or I don't know, but my sense is with IQ, when people take an IQ test, that spatial pattern recognition is a fairly big part of it. So is there a correlation with change in IQ?
Yeah. There have been studies, so there's been cognitive tests, learning and memory tests, and IQ done. And these are, again, you have a large number of people, with people with obesity, people normal weight, and then you measure their IQ and do other cognitive tests. So there's a statistically significant lower IQ and performance in cognitive tests. Now, there's another aspect of this that's very important that's become clear in, say, the last decade or so, that women that are pregnant, if they have obesity or type 2 diabetes during their pregnancy, there's a greater chance that their kid will develop or will have an autism spectrum disorder. And I've written articles on this. And essentially, what we think is happening from studies of humans, and then there's actually some human cases of autism that are caused by gene mutations. Fragile X syndrome is the most prevalent. So, as your audience probably knows, kids with autism, they typically won't make eye contact, and they'll kind of be withdrawn, and they'll have repetitive behaviors. And in animal studies, if you put the abnormal gene that causes autism in humans in an animal, they'll have a similar thing. They'll kind of withdraw from the other animals in the cage and so on. Okay, but anyway, being healthy during pregnancy is important.
Well, it sounds like being healthy before you get pregnant.
And before you get pregnant too. I should also say from that perspective that as knowledge increases, so people with heart attacks, it used to be, and this is a long time ago, that the doctors, their cardiologists would say, okay, you've had a heart attack, you need to take it easy, don't overstress your heart. And that's probably in the long run, probably the worst thing you can do is be sedentary. And it's similar for pregnant women. OBGYNs, I think, I don't know what they do now, but certainly they used to be, take it easy, don't overexert yourself. But think about from evolutionary perspective. I mean, pregnant animals and our human ancestors, they would be like out moving all day, wouldn't change much at all.
Yeah.
And their offspring are fine. So anyway, the take-home message from all this is that it's important to challenge yourself from the standpoint of exercise and moderation and energy intake. And intermittent fasting imposes a mild but beneficial stress on your cells, kind of like exercise. Mm-hmm. During the fasting, cells go into a stress resistance, conserve resources mode. And then when you eat and rest and sleep, then the cells go into a growth and improved function mode. So there's cycling back and forth between the challenge, either exercise or fasting, and recovery, resting and eating. And the optimal frequency of this cycling for exercise, it's pretty clear, like daily exercise, 30 minutes to an hour of moderate exercise seems to be pretty good for long-term health. Intermittent fasting, it's not clear because there's far fewer studies. Much of the work going on now is daily time-restricted eating, where the person will eat during only a 6 hour to 8 hour time window each day, so that they're fasting for 16 to 18 hours. And that's enough, based on many studies, that's enough of a fasting period, 16 hours, to engage or stimulate cells to go into this stress resistance, conserve resources mode. So if people eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner and a snack, they're not fasting for 16 hours, because the only time they're not eating is essentially when they're sleeping.
Yeah. Yeah. And in my background's in ancient medicine, essentially, in the system of Ayurveda, and it's the intermittent fasting there, meal spacing, and fasting is based on pulsation. So it's like if you're going to feast, you always have to do the opposite. Like if you want peak performance, you've got to work really, it's like you've really got to find that limit, and then you've got to go into the opposite, or deep rejuvenation. If you're going to feast or become full, you have to do the opposite and become empty. And even in the stomach, shrinking back. Like one of my first teachers, Dr. Vasant Lad, he would talk about how, and I see it in your study in a different way, and like with different words, because you're using allopathic medicine words and Western science, right, compared to Eastern medicine and holistic mind-body experiences. But basically, it was like, if the stomach doesn't shrink back, if it doesn't go through that emptiness, then the next time you eat, in order to feel satiation, you keep expanding the stomach. So the pulsation's off. Yeah. If you're not discovering what emptiness, and I've led detoxes for 20 years. And what we find with most people coming in, and they might be on like a better version of a standard American diet, but they still have excessive calorie intake, right? Mm-hmm. They're not fasting, is they don't know what hunger is. And then they have a lot of emotional hunger signals, but it's not coming from their stomach actually being empty. Like they haven't experienced that, where the stomach gets empty and the fat starts to be utilized. The fat starts to upcycle back into the system. The fat cells start to do something different. Can you describe what's happening with that process with inflammation, and how inflammation ties into the non-fasting or the chronic, just the eating, what excessive energy intake, eating too much too frequently?
Okay, I'll start with it's quite a bit is known now about what you're talking about in terms of what's going on and with hormones. And so there's two main hormones that essentially control how much we eat. One is called leptin. And when you eat a meal, particularly a big meal, leptin is released from cells in your body, mainly fat cells actually, and it goes in the blood up to your brain and activates circuits that make you perceive that you're full. So leptin is a stop eating hormone. You've eaten enough. Okay, then the hunger hormone is called ghrelin. So when you're fasting a long time, ghrelin goes up. And so people with obesity, they typically they're hungry a lot. They feel like they're hungry a lot. And the reason is the brain can't respond to leptin. So the stop eating signal isn't working at the level of the...
And why does it, so it stops as a result of eating too frequently?
Yes, so what it's similar to, your listeners will have heard of insulin resistance.
Yeah.
Right. And so with insulin resistance, insulin is being produced by your pancreas. And actually, people with type 2 diabetes, typically they have high levels of insulin. But their cells are resistant to insulin. They're not responding. And what insulin does is it causes cells to remove glucose from the blood. Okay, so what I described with leptin is leptin resistance.
Yeah.
So people with obesity have high levels of leptin, but their brain cells aren't responding to the leptin. Okay. And then, so, oh man. Right, so that, the real question though was, remind me what the second part was.
Well, yeah, I mean, just like what's happening at the level of leptin that you want to keep eating, right? Because something's like we somehow have overridden some evolutionary response. Like we're no longer evolving, we're degenerating, right? Our brain sizes are 10% smaller. Why are we not able to self-correct? And I'm wondering how much it also has to do with the disruption of like what is actually food now versus what was actually food before the agricultural revolution 10,000 years ago. Because to me, those two things don't look anything alike. And if we go into a grocery store, I was trying to find a date, a whole date, D-A-T-E, just a date, right? Like a form of sugar, right? In the form of a dried fruit in a massive grocery store. I mean, this grocery store was like shelves and shelves and shelves, typical American grocery store. And they didn't have a date, but they had aisles and aisles and aisles of things that had some form of sugar or a chemical sweetener.
Oh yeah, our diets are very different now. High calorie, carbohydrates, all sorts of simple sugar is really bad, and refined breads. And
how much does that have to do with leptin and that feeling of fullness versus, because from what I've also read, like we're eating, I mean, something like 75% less fiber than we were 10,000 years ago. That just, and fiber creates fullness, right? Where it actually is physical mass.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Americans eat way too little fiber. And we evolved so that I wrote an article for Scientific American like 6 years ago. And the whole point of the article was that the chemicals in fruits and vegetables, so plant materials that are good for our health, their function in the plants is to keep us and other organisms, insects, from eating too much of the plant, particularly the vital parts. And the notion that there are molecules in the fruits and vegetables that sop up free radicals, kind of a classical definition of an antioxidant, is why fruits and vegetables are good for health, is wrong. It's what's happening is there's chemicals, and they all seem to have a bitter taste, that impose stress on our cells. And we've evolved to be able to tolerate these bitter tasting, potentially noxious chemicals in a number of ways. One is the bitter taste. Another is vomiting. But the third is, well, there's actually four. Third is there's enzymes in our liver that rapidly remove these chemicals from our body. And then the fourth is the cells themselves, these chemicals. So I'll give you a name of a few that people may know: curcumin, and curry spice, and sulforaphane, which is high levels in broccoli.
Oh, yeah.
And so both of those chemicals, when they get into cells, they stimulate the cells to produce proteins that are antioxidant enzymes. And so they stimulate the cells to deal with the free radicals. So if we're just eating processed food, refined foods without these evolutionarily healthy chemicals, that's kind of another, besides too many calories, there's also not getting the benefit of those chemicals, plant chemicals.
It's a disaster.
Yeah, and then you mentioned fiber. And I'm sure you're aware of the emerging story on bacteria in the gut and health.
Yeah.
People with obesity have more unhealthy bacteria in their gut than
the dysbiosis. Yeah.
Yeah.
From lack of fiber. I mean, it's directly correlated, right? Because it's basically like good bacteria need fiber.
Yeah. But
I mean, to me, it comes down to terrain theory. Do you know terrain theory? Yeah, go ahead.
I remember what you wanted me to talk about: inflammation.
Well, it's okay. I'm going to bring us into what's going on in cognitive signaling in a second, or in the adaptive signaling pathway. But to me, just to go back to microbiome and dysbiosis and obesity and eating too frequently, and where you have that leptin resistance loop happening, from what I can understand from terrain theory versus germ theory, which is like keep the terrain healthy, and then your body will be able to adapt to new bacteria and viruses. It seems like the terrain is the microbiome, and it seems like the diet that the microbiome wants to eat is the diet that's good for healthy human DNA.
Yeah. And so the thing is, if you eat raw vegetables, you will be eating bacteria.
Right.
And they're good bacteria. Yeah. Again, we evolved eating those kinds of things. So it makes sense that we're adapted to functioning well and being healthy.
Yeah. So one of the other wild habits that I'm writing about and involved in user groups with is urine therapy. It's the idea that mammals upcycle their own urine, and it is probiotic. Probacteria seems to nourish the terrain, nourishes the microbiome, whether you put urine on skin, whether you snort it, whether you swish it in your mouth, put it in your eyes, drink it, do enemas, like anywhere it goes, it seems to nourish that specific biome. And what we find is that often people that use urine therapy, humans that use urine therapy, end up fasting longer with a lot more ease. And that gets really fascinating. They naturally drop about a third of their calories, like just from the practice of it. I see a lot with habit stacking of what habits, when someone does one habit, what habits then become easier, habits that are positive stressors, or use stressors that are usually very hard to do. And oftentimes people find intermittent fasting hard to do because, like you described with the leptin resistance and insulin resistance, it's like they have insane cravings. Their foods are craving driven and highly, toxic. it seems that when people start doing, and I have a pretty big user group now of people doing urine therapy, but there's other much, much bigger user groups than mine. Intermittent fasting, it's easy, surprisingly easy. And we don't know why. I mean, we know that ketones are upcycled. We know that there's deep hydration because it's already structured water, right? The water coming out of the body's already been in the body, ultraplasma filtrate. It seems to create a very, very deep level of hydration. I know from my work therapeutically with people that are obese, there's often a deeper dehydration, right? Where their cells are seemingly, even though they seem like they're water retentive, there's not that deep penetration, it seems like, of hydration. And from holistic medicine, we might see that in the skin, we might see it in the tongue, we might just see it in different systems of the body where there's clearly not hydration in all the different cells of the body. There seems to be like a lot of blockage.
We're getting kind of off topic, but not really. So humans have relatively high levels of uric acid in their blood compared to
other mammals.
And the reason is during evolution, there was a mutation in a gene that encodes a protein that removes uric acid. So then the question becomes, well, clearly it wasn't detrimental to have that gene mutation, and apparently it was beneficial. And if you look among primates, and this mutation occurred during, I can't remember exactly how far back in primate evolution. But anyway, there's a nice correlation between uric acid levels and lifespan.
Because uric acid becomes an antioxidant, right? When it's, I mean, unless it crystallizes.
It is an antioxidant. And then, birds, if you look, bird poop is really concentrated uric acid. They have super high levels of uric acid. And they live quite long. Bats is another thing. Bats compared to mice. Bats have high levels of uric acid. Bats can live 20 years, or a mouse only lives a couple. Yeah. So anyway, that's kind of an interesting aside. But urine has quite a bit of uric acid, so I don't know if there's any connection there or not.
It seems to be, because it thins the blood. So what people find that use it is that they're that whole thick blood or blood stagnation, that it seems to have a thinning effect. And from what I understand with stagnant blood is that usually when you have uric acid going to a crystalline state in the body, where it then becomes a toxin, right? Then it becomes something the body can't handle, the whole stone effect. Yeah. But that seems to dissolve, and there's also correlations, right, between obesity and kidney stones or urinary stones in general. So it's like, I don't know, all this stuff kind of piles up, but it does seem that urine therapy, which I was interviewing this guy who does a lot of microbiome work at Dr. Emmerin Mayer. He's at UCLA. And he was saying that there was like a lab when he witnessed lab rats, like postpartum lab rats. So basically the mothers were lapping up the urine of the babies, and it seemed to create a very strong probiotic hydration effect. Huh. And so anyways, back to food deprivation and fasting. It seems that, and this is, just curious to me, that like, that's one of the big findings that in the user groups of urine therapy is that fasting gets easier. And then that intensified cognition really uptakes. So much longer periods of focus, and even, I would say, peak experiences where there's a sense of relaxed adaptability, that relaxed beingness that naturally comes with fasting, but without the it seems like it's just an easier way in. Like it's easier to get to that state with less willpower. But I would love to talk about this whole food deprivation versus food abundance, and what's happening with intensified cognition versus cognitive complacency, and then how that goes into suboptimal cognition. And because when I read your article, part of me is like, wow, like fat becomes stupid. Like that's really where my mind went, kind of like a Saturday Night Live skit. Like that's really what this is saying, is like, if you're not fasting and you're overeating, you have suboptimal cognitive function. And like, that's not good. And cognitive complacency is really not good, especially in the day and age where we've got grocery stores that are packed of stuff that's not food. And where we have these devices that, the average human right now or westernized human is on an iPhone 3.5 hours a day. And it's usually a very consumer driven. They're not creating, they're consuming.
Yeah.
And so to me, that complacency where you have like the best marketing in the world ever happening, ever, combined with people that are at a massive disadvantage because they're in a habit culture that's driving them towards cognitive complacency.
Yeah. So what's happening in the brain with fasting and exercise and obesity? What's actually happening? With fasting and exercise, the nerve cells are more active in the brain. It's actually in multiple brain regions, hippocampus I mentioned, but other regions that are very important for learning and memory and decision-making, like the prefrontal cortex. And that activity itself, when the neurons are more active, they produce a protein called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. That protein stimulates the formation of new synaptic connections, new synapses between nerve cells. It also plays a role in
so right there, like you have more connection, right? You have more neuroplasticity, but also more interconnectivity in the physiology.
Yeah, more connections. And it's those connections, what's happening with those connections is essentially the basis for learning and memory. So kind of a simplistic way would be more connections, better learning and memory.
Yeah.
And then also, we found in my lab that exercise and intermittent fasting do two other things. They increase the number of mitochondria in the nerve cells.
In the nerve cells. Okay.
And mitochondria is the part of the cell that produces energy, ATP, which cells need to run. And that's similar to muscle cells. When you exercise, over time, the number of mitochondria in each of your muscle cells increases. And
you gain capacity is what I'm hearing in that.
Yeah, exactly. You're more energy availability when the brain cells or the muscle cells.
You're also getting endurance so that you can do it long, so you can do more, but you can also do more longer.
Yep. And then another thing we found by recording activity in the neurons, it's very interesting though. The major neurotransmitter in the brain is glutamate. It's an amino acid. More than 90% of the nerve cells in your brain deploy glutamate as their neurotransmitter. Your listeners may not have heard of glutamate. They may have heard of dopamine.
Yep.
Or serotonin, because dopamine's involved in addiction and low serotonin levels involved in depression. Psychedelics affect serotonin. But the circuitry, the excitatory neurons throughout the brain, all through the brain, cerebral cortex, use glutamate as their neurotransmitter. And the only way that other neurotransmitters affect your behavior or brain function is by subtly modifying the activity in the glutamatergic neurons. And then also throughout the brain, about a little less than 10% of the neurons use GABA as a neurotransmitter. It's an inhibitory neurotransmitter. And we found that, interestingly, when animals are adapted to intermittent fasting over a period of several weeks, there's actually increased GABA. It's kind of, there's this feedback mechanism where the bottom line is that intermittent fasting refines the neural network activity to more optimal balance between excitation and inhibition. Mm-hmm. And it has an
So you're not wasting energy is what I'm hearing in that. Like,
yeah, making more efficient, the brain more efficient. And right, and then we found that in mice, intermittent fasting has an anti-anxiety effect. Exercise, and everybody should know that exercise improves mood. We think that in animals and humans, once they are adapted to intermittent fasting, their mood improves.
Yeah.
And we've actually seen that in some of our studies. We give people questionnaires on their mood. But it takes several weeks to a month.
Yeah, it's not
for people to adapt so that they're no longer hungry and irritable during the time period that they would have previously been eating.
Yeah.
And that's kind of a key point for people to know, that this takes a while. Just like with exercise, it takes for a while for you to get in shape if you've been sedentary.
Yeah.
Similar with intermittent fasting, it takes time to adapt so that you actually feel very good when you're on intermittent fasting. And again, similar exercise. Most people probably, if they get in shape, they'll feel really good as long as they keep exercising. If they stop, they won't, their mood will start to go down.
Yeah. Well, and it's like the positive stressors and dopamine, right? It's like you do the hard thing, you get the reward hormones. You do the easy thing all the time, you degenerate. And then that whole cognitive complacency, you're less able to do the hard thing. Like that's a negative bias, right? Where it's harder because you're in a negative mindset to do the hard thing.
Yeah. Yep.
So when you look at, when I'm looking at your chart and I'm seeing suboptimal cognition, vulnerability to injury and disease. I mean, the other thing that I see is that, again, with that negative bias, it's harder for people to make good decisions today that are better for their long-term future. And instead they make the easy decision today that gives them that's more based on the addictive habit of yesterday, and is part of that negative stress or downward spiral into chronic inflammation, plus obesity, plus, this shrinking brain size, suboptimal condition, dementia, right? Because it goes to Alzheimer's and dementia. So not good, but hard to change. And what I'm wondering, even in terms of someone being like, okay, I'm going to intermittent fast, or I'm going to go into the grocery store and I'm going to actually find the vegetable section and fill my cart up with vegetables, and instead of stuff from the frozen food section. If you're operating under suboptimal cognition, I'm like, where is this going? Like, where is this going? And also what's happening, just to make it harder for you, like, where does this go with public policy? Like, if we're subsidizing corn and sugar crops, like we're not making it easy on people that already have lower IQ. And now we're lowering their IQ. So like, what are we in for?
That's not good. Not only the processed food industries, but also the pharmaceutical industries. They're advertising, essentially saying, okay, they're not saying this, but it's kind of implied that that they they don't really care if you get sick, but they have something that can lessen your symptoms. And that kind of psychologically gives people the idea that, well, I don't really have to watch what I eat and exercise because there'll be some drug or some, medical thing that'll take care of me. And in some cases, that's true. I mean, with heart disease, right? A lot of people now who've had a heart attack will get bypass surgery and they'll live for a long time, where they would have previously died. But a lot of chronic diseases, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, cancers is still a big problem. That's one thing we haven't talked about, but there's a lot of, quite a few clinical trials now of fasting and cancer focused on having the person be on some fasting regimen during the time they're getting chemotherapy or radiation therapy. Because it turns out it's easier to kill the cancer cells when they're in an energy. They use mainly glucose as their energy source. They tend not to be able to use fats and ketones. So the animal studies have clearly shown you hit the cancer cells with chemotherapy or radiation, when they have low levels of energy, they die much more easily. And then on the other hand, your normal cells respond adaptively to the fasting. So they're actually, we think, more resistant to the damaging effects of the drugs or radiation. So there's a lot of,
I've read that same thing with dysbiosis. But basically bad bacteria get starved out, good bacteria win. They actually need the rest. They get the break. The bad bacteria get starved out and the terrain gets stronger for the good bacteria that are creating the hormones that regulate the human cells.
But I guess if this kind of being facetious, but I guess if, people aren't worried about being overweight and out of shape, I can just get a fecal transplant.
Yeah.
From a healthy person.
Yeah.
Actually,
that's where it's going. I mean, for sure. I mean, I feel like urine therapy is a little easier and you can just do it yourself. But yeah. So lastly, I just want to ask you with the studies with new viruses like COVID and with comorbidities, people, it seems like there's just very direct correlations from the studies between people that are already high in comorbidities, already high in chronic inflammation to the point where it's a diagnosable disease or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. And these are the people that are actually high risk because their bodies can't adapt.
Yeah.
So has it driven you nuts that you haven't seen any like public service announcements around intermittent fasting? I mean, you just wrote this book, you've done research for the last 20 to 30 years. And this intermittent fasting revolution that you've written, right? Like from what I can see, that's really happening with intermittent fasting in the revolution is it's like people that are interested in peak performance, whether they're coming at it from like my community is coming at it from an enlightenment perspective, like my people like want to be a fully awake human being. Other people might come at it from wanting to make a lot of money and knowing that their brain health is really freaking important. So they might come at it from more of like a Western conquer the world kind of place. But these are the people that are doing the intermittent fasting. These are the peak performers. These are the people, the health nuts, the yogis, right? Like we're the ones leading the way. And it seems like public policy is just nowhere.
So, right. So you're saying, why isn't there something like with the smoking campaign to reduce smoking, where you have an ad that essentially, in that case, shows a lung that's, black or whatever, from
it's like I sometimes watch NFL with my husband. And so the NFL, there's 2 types of NFL, there's maybe 3 types of NFL commercials. There's like the tech commercials. The other 2 types are food. Like here's this, some fast food, Pizza Hut, Taco Bell, like some fast food, and then pharmaceuticals.
And beer.
Right? And what?
Beer.
Oh, and beer. right? And this is the messaging, is like, you can have all this stuff and then this will fix you.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. It was interesting when I was at NIH. So NIH, you know, they're supporting, they actually have put some money into clinical trials of intermittent fasting, but the government's like very hesitant to, you know, to spend any money, seems like, to get people to exercise, intermittent fast, you know, whatever. They'll put out guidelines and stuff, but it's not showing
like
up.
Fauci's not standing up and telling people to skip a meal.
Halftime of a football game. It's
right.
It's not there. Right?
What would it take for Fauci to get up and say skip a meal? Like, all you have to do to lower your chance of COVID, really, or any new virus or bacteria really messing you up, is just skip a meal every day. Just skip one of your meals. Like, how far are we from that, and why? Because I mean, I'm coming from the sort of holistic scene, and they're like conspiracy theory, blah, blah, blah. It's all like, you know, the pharmaceutical and the government are married to each other, and the food industry, and there's no stepping in there. But what, you come from NIH and science, like, what's your perspective on it?
I'm still for the perspective. Yeah, it's really a problem with the internet now. But what I'm really optimistic about, the reason that, I wrote an article with a colleague of mine for the New England Journal of Medicine that came out a couple of years ago now. And the editors of the New England Journal finally thought it was time to have an article on intermittent fasting, because there have been now literally hundreds of studies in humans that clearly show that people are overweight can benefit. And then we did a study in asthma patients, for example, showing it's beneficial, and so on. And so it turns out a lot of doctors now are aware of it, because patients have been coming to them saying, hey, have you heard about this? You know, what about this? And they didn't know that there was a lot of science behind it.
Yeah. On
the other hand, there's no representatives from an intermittent fasting company going to the doctor's office.
Yeah.
Kind of smoozing with them. And
I was just thinking Victor Longo and Dr. Victor Longo, right? And he has a fasting kit for 5-day fast.
Walter Longo.
Walter. Yeah. Oh yeah. So it's like, we need him to go big.
No, I think that's fine. Although, you know, the benefits he sees with his, 5 days a month.
Yeah.
Eating only 700 calories of healthy food. I think you don't have to spend $200 on that.
Oh gosh, no! I hacked the whole system, and people can spend $20, and they already have it in their fridge. They don't even need anything, right?
It's the fasting that's the benefit.
Yeah. Amen. Amen to that. I don't want to promote your book. So, The Intermittent Fasting Revolution: The Science of Optimizing Health and Enhancing Performance. It's coming out in a couple weeks.
Yeah.
February 1st. What? Tell me, in terms of what drove you to write the book?
The main reason is there isn't a book out there that covers the science. Yeah. There are a lot of books saying, this is the basics of, what it is. From a practical standpoint, it's pretty trivial in many sense, but yeah, so there wasn't something out that covers everything, whole body, brain, what are the effects, what's going on in the cells, what's going on with this metabolic switch from glucose to ketones, how do the ketones affect body and brain, what about disease? And so, summarizing the results of animal studies showing that intermittent fasting is beneficial in type 2 diabetes, models of type 2 diabetes, stroke, and so on. And then there's a chapter at the end on, actually, I've got a whole chapter on kind of the dark side that we just talked about with the food industry, pharmaceutical industry, kind of, and the advertising, and then the last chapter is on like practical advice and so on. I don't know, and hopefully people will learn a lot that they don't know.
And it sounds like a really great book, in the intermittent fasting list of books that are now super popular, right? For someone who actually wants to understand the science.
Yeah.
Awesome. And what are you working on next?
I have another book that it's on the brain's most important neurotransmitter, glutamate. Because I've done a lot of work on that in the years. It plays important roles in the brain development, in learning. It's the learning and memory neurotransmitter, and it turns out that it's involved in a lot of neurological disorders. Epilepsy is it's the excitatory transmitter in the brain. So in epilepsy, the glutamate synapses are just going crazy. But more subtly, a similar thing is actually occurring in Alzheimer's disease. There's inability of the cells to constrain their network activity.
Yeah.
People with Alzheimer's have much higher incidence of seizures compared to people without. Even autism, turns out, same thing. There's kind of hyperexcitability of the neural networks, so that things aren't being controlled properly. And then I'm going to start a podcast on, it's on the brain. On the brain for, I want it to be, the plan is it's going to be at a level that most people can understand. Certainly people who have taken like this biology, basic biology, or have, so that's what I'm doing now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming and unpacking your article a bit on the evolutionary perspective.
Okay, Kate, I enjoyed the conversation.